2 previous decades, we've seen an increasing use of coal in the energy mix around the world in the last decade or so. Now, all this is in Working Group 3 report. So we don't start in a very good place. We don't start in a very good place from the point of view of concentrations. We are now, depending how you do the sums, around 430 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. Well, if we want a 2/3 chance of holding below 2 degrees, we can't go much over 450. We're adding 2.5 parts per million a year. We're going to be through that 450 in half a dozen years or so. So we're in a world where we're close to the margins of where we need to go. So everything I've said tells us that we have to act strongly and we have to start now. Delay is dangerous. Delay is dangerous for 2 reasons. One is that this is a ratchet effect. The flows of emissions go into the concentrations of greenhouse gases. And second, the later we leave it, the more we lock in high carbon capital and infrastructure. So I think it's very important to recognize the starting place is not good from the point of view of the growth of emissions and from the point of view of the concentration starting point. Now let me go forward from there. What would we have to do to give us this chance of holding to 2 degrees? I mean, you can give yourself a 2/3 probability as most of the language of Working Group 3, or you can give yourself a 50-50 probability. There you've got a little more leeway, not much. But where would you have to be relative to the 50 billion ton CO2 equivalent we are now 40 or so years from now, in the middle of this century? Well, we would have to be around 20. You can do the sums and say it should be 17, 18. You can do the sums and say it should be 23, 24. It doesn't matter very much from the point of view of the strategic direction that we're talking about. We've got to get 50 down to 20 in 40 years or so, billion tons CO2 equivalent per annum as a world. Well, what's the makeup of the 50 now? Let's just subdivide a little bit in terms of the geography. I started global, and let's look a little bit at the big components of that. China is about 9 tons per capita, roughly speaking. It's the biggest emitter, so I'll start with the biggest one. And so if you multiply by the population of China, you've got 11 or 12 billion tons. United States, more like 20 tons per capita, 350 million or so of them. So you've got maybe 7. You've got, in Europe, perhaps 550 million people at 10, 11, 12 tons per capita. You've got another 6 or 7 or so, maybe 6 there. So 11 and 6 and 7, I mean, you're talking about half that 50, where we are now, coming from those groups. And they add up to ballpark little over 2 billion. So the nearly 5 billion other people in the world are contributing the other half, that other 25. So that other half is maybe 5 tons per capita. And India, again, depending how you do the sums, around 2, maybe slightly below, but around 2 tons per capita. So that's where we start. Now, where do we need to get to? Well, we need to get to around 20. Well, in 40 years from now, there'll be around 9 billion people. So 20 divided by 9 is sort of 2, close to 2. We've got to be, as a world, around 2 ton per capita, roughly where India is now, right? It's very important when we speak of 2 degrees and the international target of 2 degrees to recognize what it means in terms of the arithmetic. and you find that world leaders are perfectly happy to talk about the importance of 2 degrees. We will follow the science, we will listen to the science. But the arithmetic I've just done, they will not do, and they will not recognize. There's nothing, I've not got any economics in what I've said up to now. It is the science and it's the arithmetic. Yeah? But unless we recognize the magnitude of the task, that we have to get down as a world to something like 2 tons per capita, we will not be addressing the problem in an honest way. And we have to start there. Yeah? Now, probably there will not be many people below 2 tons per capita. Well, an average is an average. If the average is 2 tons per capita and there are not many people below 2 tons per capita, well, there can't be many people above 2 tons per capita. This is not a normative statement about equity. Nothing. No economics, no ethical statements, just arithmetic up to now, right? So we've got to think, how can the world get to roughly 2 tons per capita? We've reframed the question, which said we want to give ourselves a decent chance of 2 degrees, and without anything other than the science and the arithmetic, we've said we've got to have a world which is roughly, on average, 2 tons per capita. So probably, if we are to do it, much of the world will be clustered around there. I'll come back to whether we can find some big negatives in a few minutes, because that could help us get out of some of this. But you know, you don't want to assume too much about that side of things. So that's what we have to do. So where are we going? Well, let's again start with the big emitters, because we got to half the emissions that way, so it makes sense to start with the big ones. Where is China going? Well, China is going on upwards for the moment. It's around 9 tons per capita, but, and I was with Chinese colleagues, and this was the NCE, New Climate Economy discussion with our Chinese colleagues 3 weeks or so away in Beijing, and we heard still more strongly the story that's been emerging in China for 4 or 5 years now, of a country that is deeply engaged on this issue and deeply worried about this issue for a number of reasons. One is that climate change is all about water, and China has been for millennia deeply concerned with its water problems, and indeed it's a country which is largely run by engineers from Tsinghua University who do analyze and take seriously these problems. The UK representation of engineers and scientists in the cabinet is, I think it's actually 0. So China is unusual in this respect. But that's one reason, that there are serious people at the top who recognize the water issues in China and see this as a real threat. It's a country that depends on flows off the Himalayas. It's a country that is population clustered around the eastern seaboard, and so on. There's every reason they should worry. They recognize that they're very big, of course they do, in the emissions, but they recognize they're very big in people's reactions to what China does. So they see that what they do matters a great deal. They're deeply concerned with air pollution and water pollution for very good reason. And they also see this as an opportunity in a green race which they rather back themselves to win, and if that's the margin of competition, then good luck to them. So there's a very serious commitment. There is a talking of peaking, there's been a talking for some time of total emissions in China peaking in 2030. Now, in more relaxed atmospheres, you do sometimes get talk of peaking at 2025. Some of that will be crystallized, or when the 13th five-year plan is released towards the end of next year. There's strong discussion, quite determined discussion, of peaking the use of coal within 10 years. Yeah? Is also strong discussion of, instead of a target of emissions per unit of output, and China has 45% target emissions per unit of output 2005 to 2020. Probably the strongest target in the world of emissions per unit of output. Stronger than the absolute reductions in Europe and the United States, which are not as high as 45%. But they are likely to set a target in terms of absolute emissions going forward. All this is likely, but likely in the sense that the technocratic people that talk to people like us are very happy to discuss those issues in an open way. That's not necessarily a total prediction of what will come out the other end, but there are open discussions along those lines. So China is engaging very strongly, but China will probably peak, if it does peak at 2025, 2030, it might well peak around 13 or 14 tons per capita. I mean, it's already at 9 or so, yeah? 12, 13, 14, we don't know, but that's a ballpark. Well, that would mean that in 25 years, China would have to go from 13 tons per capita down to 2. That's a hard ask, yeah? But at least they're asking, yeah? Now, you've got USA and Europe, you know, around 20 and 11 or 12 tons per capita. Well, they've both set themselves the target of cutting by 80%. Now, actually, the US, relative to 1990 normally, if Europe did that, it would get to 2 tons per capita. The US wouldn't. It'd be more like 4. So you've got, as it were, in those big blocks, at least some recognition of not only the direction of travel, but the magnitude of change. Now let's look at India doing the same kind of arithmetic. Well, you're going to crawl over that arithmetic in this next day and a half. But it looks hard, yeah? And we ought to recognize that it looks hard. You're around 2 tons per capita now. We all hope that the Indian economy in 2040, well, you can name a number. If you name 7% growth rates for 4 decades, you're multiplying by 16, yeah? Right? 2 to the 4th. Double. 7% doubles in a decade, 4 decades, 2 to the 4th, factor of 16. I frankly doubt whether India will be 16 times as big, but I mean, let's hope it's 10 times as big. That would be good, right? I mean, all of us who are deeply committed to India would want to see that kind of growth. So the name of the game is to do that whilst cutting emissions, say, in the second half of that period very drastically. They will grow in the first part of that period. But again, we're just taking the arithmetic and asking ourselves, what is the magnitude of change here? And I think it's very important to do that honestly and frankly. Otherwise, you're just not engaging in the magnitude of the transition that needs to take place. So what we're talking about in India is probably some kind of change which would see emissions growing for a couple of decades and then starting to fall. So our question for ourselves and for the world is, could that be done? And that's one we have to try to answer, and that's the work that's going on with the new climate economy and ICRIER. But I wanted to insist on the magnitude of that change if we really are serious, as I hope we are, about the global 2 degrees. And after all, India would suffer probably more than most other places if that fails. This isn't some nebulous public good that you're sort of thinking about to be nice to other people. This is something that's deeply in the interests of India, the developing world, all of us. Now, I wanted to start from there because it's fundamental. Now, IPC Working Group 3 talks about the costs and it talks about the policies of making those changes, and it talks about investment requirements of another couple of % of GDP over a period of time. You know, Might be a little above in some periods, might be a little below in others, but that's the kind of ballpark, 2 to 3% investments that it talks about, over and above what you might otherwise have done. Now, given that those investments will lead to discovery, embody innovation, carry all kinds of co-benefits, cleaner, quieter, safer, more energy secure, more biodiverse, and of course contribute to radically reducing the dreadful consequences of the 4 or 5 degrees that we're headed for, it sounds like a good investment. But you've got to go through what does it mean, how does that happen, what kind of policies are necessary. The IPCC refers to the risks very strongly. It refers to the co-benefits. But there's not much detail on the co-benefits, the cleaner, quieter, safer, more biodiverse, more energy secure, and so on. It refers to them strongly, but it doesn't go into much detail. And it doesn't go into much detail on policies, although it discusses a few of them. So in a sense, that's the beginning of the work of the new climate economy, about the detail of the policies and the actions that could possibly get you there. So it sort of introduces, in a way, it takes you up to the point where this work begins, it mentions what needs to be done, but it doesn't do it. And that's why the work of the specifics on policy and the analysis of the co-benefits are so important. And let's just remind us where we are heading. We are heading, as they point out very clearly, sometime about 2100, to a median global surface temperature about 4 degrees centigrade or more above the middle of the 19th century. That's the plan, that's the path which they describe as the path that we're on. And 4 or 5 degrees is roughly the difference between now and the last ice age, right? When the ice sheets came down to